Alisha Raghavan is Chief Design Officer at Pensaar Design. I spoke to her about how people's expectations and perception of design thinking in India has changed over the last 10 to 15 years. We spoke about how Pensaar Design applied design thinking to their own approach to transformation programs. It's interesting how important education and alignment of stakeholders is. Realizing its importance is probably the rite of passage for consulting companies. We also spoke about the role of empathy and teaching in an organization. If you're curious about design thinking and how you can adopt its principles to thinking about different aspects of running a company, you'll find this chat quite interesting.
This is the CTQ Smartcast, where we have conversations about upleveling, deliberate practice, and getting future relevant.
Hi, welcome Alisha. Welcome to the CTQ Smartcast.
Thanks, Harish. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so we're going to start with a slightly a tricky one. Probably it's going to show that you've been through this for a long time. But we want to talk about the whole journey of design thinking as a practice slash space domain, whatever you want to call it, in India, and also sort of juxtapose it with how Pensaar Design has been working over the last few years. So if you can talk us through that journey, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. When I started my career almost, more than a decade back, I'd heard of the word design thinking. But even when I was working with design agencies, nobody was really familiar with design thinking at that point in time. It was a buzzword in the design industry in India at that point in time, but definitely not outside the design industry. Move from there maybe a decade later is really when I seen it pick up, where it's not just design companies, but companies across different industries, tech firms, manufacturing companies, all of them that have heard about it, but also heard about the value of it. And it's been quite wonderful to see that change and put that into practice as well over the last decade and more of design thinking truly really being in the industry and being practiced in the industry. But saying that, if I go back to 6 to 7 years back when Pensaar started, in the tech industry and in, like I mentioned, some of the other industries where our clients are, it was still a buzzword. So it was something that we sort of checked box and said, I'm going to do design thinking for my organization. So we would get a lot of requests to do design thinking in a 2-day session, in a 3-day session, get people familiar with design thinking, had them become design thinkers in 2 to 3 days. And they felt that their team would be ready to solve problems just being exposed to it. From there, we've again seen a sea change where people realize that it's a transformation journey that the organization has to go through, and it isn't just about being exposed or exposed to that concept, but really practicing it, trying it on for size, and then also making it a little bit of their own, because it's not something that you can just start to adopt within an organization from day one.
Yeah. So, like I always keep saying, future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed, right? So I'm sure you'll still get some companies who will come and ask you to do a 2-day workshop on design thinking. Just get us started, and from there we'll be able to do it. What is your response to companies like this? When somebody comes and says, "Can you just get us started on design thinking?"
Yeah. So I think over time, Harish, I think what we've been able to build is help them understand that there's a journey and a continuum where you start with awareness, but understand what your goal is. Are you looking for them to be practitioners? Are you looking for them to be catalysts? And depending on what your goal is, then we can then advise them and say that maybe you want to start with awareness, but definitely have a roadmap of how you want to get to being catalysts or to being active practitioners within the organization. And while most people do have an appetite for it, or they do realize that they need to come back to it, it can't just be a 2-day session done once in a month, once in a year and then forgotten.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other value that an external agency like yours brings to the table is the very fact that you would have the interdisciplinary team, which most companies may not have. Right. So when you actually go in and talk about these kind of things, what makes it easier for somebody like you to do it. How do they respond? Just trying to get a sense of the whole level of awareness and response to design thinking as a concept first before we go deeper into what you're doing.
Yeah. So I think there are pros and cons. When we go as an external interdisciplinary team into an organization, we bring a fresher perspective that's not biased by the existing understanding or the existing customer experience. And while that's the pro, it's also the con, because it's like I think we get it so often. The most asked question is, can you show me a case study that applies to my industry? And there's never going to be a case study that's going to match that exact company, that exact industry in the way that they're looking for. And people, they ask for, can you give us a presentation after that 2-day event? But it's not a formula. People are used to it being a structured formula. You just give it to me. Okay, this is what I'm supposed to do, and magic's going to happen. So we have to sort of guide them through that understanding that you're not going to get it in the first go. There are certain small practices that you can start to incorporate from the get-go, but it's a process. It's a journey where you slowly expand your ability to think that way, to approach problems that way, to work with your teams that way.
Right. Yeah. I remember when I was first exposed to design thinking, I think back in 2007 or 8, the biggest sort of aha moment for me was the fact that design thinking put a lot of importance on prototyping. Something which is concrete, and then make incremental changes, and that would be that was like the biggest thing for me, that I can actually see it. It's not some vague idea in my mind or in someone else's mind. Having said that, I've also seen this same thing work differently for some people who want this big bang solution. They're not big fans of this incremental change, but we know that prototyping and making these small experiments and actually getting feedback is what makes these solutions sort of robust. How do you sort of again respond to things like these, where people want this big bang magic pills to start with?
Yeah. Fortunately, I think what's happened, Harish, is concepts like MVP and have worked in the industry. People understand iterating. There has been talk of as design thinking only help with incremental innovation versus those big bang innovations that you're talking about. But actually, how we talk about it is that it's about that whole concept of failing fast. If you're able to figure out what could go wrong right away, and so there's prototyping, but there's also testing for customer behavior, the whole experimentation, the lean experimentation process. If you're able to understand all of that and pivot, if you need to pivot right away, you can still get to your big bang, but at least you'll get to your big bang knowing and being more sure of what you built, versus being completely surprised that you thought it'll work and it was going to be this big bang innovation, but people didn't warm up to it or adopt it the way you thought. So it's actually not coming in the way, it's actually helping that process of, that big bang process in a short period of time to get to your big bang faster than, waiting years to build it out and create this marvelous thing that nobody's adopting.
Right. Yeah. So, something that you mentioned some time ago about these principles of design thinking. So, if you were to, talk about what are these principles, the way you change your thinking in general, what would you recommend as, the elements of design thinking that everyone, probably CXOs in companies should adopt in generally the way they operate in the company and the way they lead, not necessarily as a problem to be fixed using design thinking, but what are these principles or elements that they can adopt?
Yeah, I think, honestly, it goes down to the root and that culture of how you work together. Often what we've seen in large organizations is eventually, because when you scale, the focus becomes more operational. You feel like you've got enough customer data, so you don't feel like you need to go back to understand the customer. But as your company is evolving, the customer is also changing and evolving over time. So in terms of the principles, if I really have to think about it, there's the one that it's so stupidly simple, but it's so amazing. When you're collaborating with, even when you're with teams or you're with as a leader, with the rest of your team, discussing something, there is this concept of think independently together. We talk about it is when you're in a group and there is a leader in that room, there is this whole concept of hippo decisions being made. The highest paid person in the office, whatever they say runs, everybody's going to be more agreeable to that. But there's a concept in design thinking that great ideas can come from anywhere. And so when you think independently together, when you take the time where each individual is able to think on their own and have the ability to present what they've thought, without, of course, dissent, with that whole acceptance, you don't know what could come out of it. But if you're just going to have everybody talk at each other, that's not really collaboration. It's actually more long-winded because you'll never arrive at anything, or you're just going to go with the first idea that the boss says.
Right. Yeah. And people often tend to call these discussions brainstorming, and we have to generally go and sort of correct them that this is what brainstorming really means. We get them to sort of go back, write down their individual ideas, and then come back and then use the we end up doing some improv exercises to get them to figure out the yes and then work together. So yeah, I can fully understand what you're talking about. Wanted to ask about specific, say, flows in companies, things like, and because we work a lot with companies where we are trying to help them build and scale their culture. How should, say, somebody working in HR or people functions think about using design thinking in, say, improving the experience for a candidate or onboarding experience of an employee who's just joined? How can they use concepts like design thinking in improving the experience there?
So I mean, in the last 7 years of Pensaar, we've seen design thinking being used across a variety of problems, and I think looking at it internally is no different. Who we call customers for in design thinking, it's basically the customer of the problem. And so in the case for HR, that customer is your internal employees, your new joinees. And the first place to get started is to really understand the customer, to be able to empathize with the customer. So really, talking to some of the employees who've been there for a while, some employees who joined, really recently, or potentially people who are going to join, to really understand their experiences, to understand what their challenges or pain points were, what really made them happy, and even possibly right after they joined, what was that, what did they struggle with? Because only when you understand all of that and you bring all of that together, look at all of that, not just one person's information, but you've spoken to a variety of people and bring that together, try making sense of it, connecting the dots, and looking at what are some of those unmet needs, what are some of those actionable insights. Then you can come up with solutions that'll truly benefit them. Sure. So yeah, I think from when you understand that employee experience, you'll also understand what matters to them, what we call customer benefits, how they measure success. So even when you do come up with a solution, it's not just looking at your business or KPI metrics, internal metrics for the HR to look at, okay, this is going well, but you can also look at how the employees measure success with that experience, and be able to evaluate that solution that you've created and keep iterating on that as well. Especially given the pandemic, even employee expectations and experiences have changed. How new joinees look at their employee experience is very different from pre-pandemic. So even in the last 2 years, it's changed so much that it's important for anybody to keep going back to their customer and really understanding what matters to them, what are some of their challenges, and iterate on what that experience, the solution that they're trying to design.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, extending this, to these larger companies over the last 3-4 months, we've heard from and worked with companies which have been, trying to debate this return to office decision. Should they make it hybrid? Should they make it, 1 week in the month or 1 day in the week? And, how do they do this? It's been a major conundrum for a lot of these larger companies. The smaller companies have sort of, been nimble enough to go ahead and say that we will let people decide. It's also probably their demographics, the demographics of the decision makers. Whereas in the larger companies, what has happened is the decision makers are the slightly senior folks who've probably always been used to working in office. So they're not really in tune with working from home or remote working and all that. And it's been a big challenge. Two sort of layers that I see there is even people who have sort of tried to get inputs from employees. Some people have seen it as doing lip service, so they're going to ask us about all these things, but they're going to anyways do whatever they want to do. Has been an underlying sort of belief that people have expressed in larger companies, and in some cases, though decision makers wanted to actually factor in everything, they just lack that empathy of different personas. Like say how would a 23-year-old engineering pass out from some remote part of the country, what would she be thinking about if I'm going to force them to come to Bangalore and join work, because they've never sort of lived that experience. So there are two things. One is there is this lack of trust that yes, they're going to ask me all these things, but they're going to do whatever they want to do anyways. And the second part is this genuine lack of empathy. So what's your response to this? And especially for the second one, for leaders who want to build that empathy, what is the way that they can actually do this? Because it's an unknown. They don't even know this. So how do you actually work towards it?
Yeah. I think going back to the first one, the lip service, it's also about how genuine you are in terms of collecting that, having those conversations and collecting that information. If it's just like a quick survey that you're doing, of course, that's not going to really get to the root of understanding them, and of course it's going to seem a little bit not authentic or genuine and just something that they're doing. And from a perspective of building empathy, I think it's important for leaders to make time to have some of those conversations. Understandably, so they can't have all of those conversations, and there can be a team, but at least to be part of some of those, to see it for themselves and to be able to hear it from. There's nothing like being able to hear it from the customer directly. And whenever I refer to the customer, I can go and tell a leader that this is what your employees are saying. But when they listen to it themselves, and when they're part of that conversation themselves, it's different, because it's you can't but help with empathy. Of course, you have to come leaving your biases aside, but it's also that your customer sitting in front of you saying something, and you have to keep your mind open, and you can't but help listen to it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think these are actionable tips for some of our listeners and viewers about how to develop this empathy. They have to take time. Like I think I read this as the recipe of some French cooking recipe book, right? So they gave all the ingredients, and this is the most important ingredient is time. You have to give it time. Without time, nothing is going to happen.
Right. Absolutely. It could be one conversation or two conversations. Yeah. It's not like I completely understand leaders are pressed for time, but even if they're able to spare an hour or two to have those one or two conversations and to truly make the time to understand that individual, that's more than enough to help them build that empathy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So let's move tracks and let's talk about some of the projects that you have done. And I know you have this 6-step culture journey. That Pensar has come up with for culture transformation. So can you talk us through that and give us some concrete examples of how you have helped companies using design thinking?
Sure. So how we reach that 6-step the cultural transformation journey was through the things that I was telling you up front, that when we first started, people were talking to us about 2 days and help introduce people to design thinking or make them design thinkers. And over time, as we made some of those mistakes, or we tried to do things a particular way, there was a lot of learning from some of those failures as well. So how the 6-step journey then evolved is to start with, building a case for that transformation. For us, it's customer centricity and innovation, but we've also used it for safety and other such cultural transformations. In the past, for example, we worked with this really large global consulting firm, and they were looking to get their high performers to be introduced to design thinking and to really be able to be more innovative. So the innovation head, that their leader had reached out to us saying, "This is what I'm looking to do, and this is my objective and goal." And we went ahead and started working with the high performers. Halfway through, what we realized is that that's not necessarily the goal that the rest of the leaders had. Here we were trying to create a safe space to say that, you fail fast and you learn from it and you incorporate these processes, and it's not going to right away. You'll start to see small wins and early successes, but it takes time. Nobody's putting the pressure on you to start delivering right away. We had other leaders come in and say, the reason you're doing this is because now you're going to have to show, say, an X percentage of improvement. So our learning there was that our first step is not to just have our SPOC and our sponsor, be in alignment with them, but we really need to make sure that, we're working with all of the leaders, that all of the leaders are aligned in terms of that vision, because at the end of the day, the team that you're working with, they're going to have to hear from different leaders, and if they're hearing opposing thoughts, it's really going to confuse them, and it's really not going to help that transformation within the organization, and it's not going to be very successful. So even though we tried a few cycles of trying to work with them, that leadership alignment was something that was very, very important for us. So our first step is about building a case with the leadership, showing them external successes of applying this transformation, and also working with hearing from their customers about the perspective of the organization, and hearing from internally what their perspective is. So getting an outside-in perspective and an inside-out perspective of the organization. So using that to build that case. So it's not, we're using design thinking even there to help build that case, for them to hear about what their customers are saying, for them to hear what their employees think of their customers, bringing that up to them and really making them see that case for transformation is real and it's needed. The second step is building, showing, building an internal success, building internal success stories, because we brought external success stories to this, but we've not really, how do you build that confidence? So to do that, we need to influence their mindsets. And so what we do is we take on a few projects where, there is a select team that's able to apply this new way of thinking and learning to those projects in a given period of time. So we work with them to do that, and we influence the leadership mindsets by seeing those early successes. Then we work with the leadership in what we call leadership alignment to build uh, their own version of what or that framework of what that transformation is for their organization. So aligning all the leaders to get that, working across different leadership so that everybody is singing out of the same hymn book.
Right.
And again, these go through multiple cycles because you're trying to create a shared vision for the organization during this leadership alignment phase. Once the leadership is at a place where they're all singing out of the same hymn book, there are certain internal successes and examples of this change being applied and it having results. All of this happens fairly, I would say, in 2 to 3 months. It's not a really long period, even though I'm saying it like that. Once that's happened is when you start to align the rest of the organization to it. So it's the whole organizational alignment. You look at how you can communicate the shared vision. How can you create excitement for the shared vision while building these catalysts of change? Because the leaders alone can't write that change. So we need to have a few catalysts who tried this on for size, had early successes. And once that starts to happen, you reach a place where you need to now design the organization to be able to carry this forward and to be able to scale it across the organization. And that is in itself a process. And the last is to sustain that momentum, because there's all of that excitement and attention when the leaders are focused on it. But once for it to become daily practice, but also for it to stay the way that people work, you need to be able to sustain that momentum and keep also evolving that, increasing the number of catalysts, training the trainer, all of that. So it's if I had to just sort of quickly sum that up, it starts with building a case. Then it's about influencing leadership mindsets. Then it's about leadership alignment, then organizational alignment, then organizational design, and then sustaining the momentum. So it starts small, then grows bigger, and then really becomes a way of life within that organization.
Right. Yeah, I think it's very interesting that you sort of stumbled upon the importance of the leadership alignment and the organization alignment as being super critical for the success of what you would do in step 5 and 6. Right. I think that's a result of you applying design thinking to your own problem statement, I guess.
Absolutely. We call it eating our own dog food constantly, because there are so many times, okay, you hear a leader and then they say, everybody's behind it. But so one of the things that we make sure to do is really do all of those stakeholder interviews, really understand everyone's perspective, because it might all seem like they're behind it, but their thoughts and perspective about it may vary. So making sure that everyone's on the same page, or all of their concerns are being addressed, and together they've come up with something that accounts for everyone's way of thinking is really, really important.
Right. Yeah, you have to bridge that think, say, do gap among leaders.
Yes.
Yeah. So, if you can give me some concrete examples of, where this has worked, and any place that you can talk about where, in spite of all these efforts, things did not work because of something else that was out of your control or whatever. Can you give us some concrete examples?
Yeah. So prior to creating the 6-step process is where things have been worked. It's either been in terms of leadership alignment, or very quickly just not expecting results. So that's one of the reasons why when we're influencing leadership mindsets, we're also building those internal successes and getting people to try it on for size. And before it becomes a way of life, we feel like even for the catalysts, they need to try it out at least 3 times, before they can truly be comfortable. You're not going to learn the entire process of design thinking, applying it on one project. After which, when we've used it for a large global security firm where they were looking to, they were very successful. But, there was foresight from the leadership that, you want to make sure that while everything is going well, we're thinking of the future, and we certainly need to be more customer centric. And So they brought us in to help the organization be more customer centric, and we work across. When we went into building a case, we looked at speaking with teams across the globe, trying to understand their perspectives, understand how they perceive the customer. And we also did the whole understanding of the customer across the globe in terms of how they see the product and how they perceive safety and security as well. And then we worked with the catalysts. And when people had we just done a boot camp, taught everyone design thinking, gone away, everyone would have believed that they learned it and they could apply it. But when they had to start applying it on key projects that mattered to the organization, and when we had to coach them on certain challenges that came up, because these are years and years of thinking a particular way. That's when they started to see that change. We've had wonderful stories of an engineer going out and speaking to customers, and he built some product. And then when he went out to the customer and he saw the pain that the customer was having with a product that he built, he said, I can never go back to the way I work, because now I've really seen, I thought this was a product that was working efficiently, but when I see the customer pain and challenge, there is no way that I can go back to just sitting in my office and working on something. The other aspect was in the way that the leaders also coached and spoke to their teams. So it was a matter of also, having leaders that worked with them, being coached in the kind of questions they asked. If a lot of focus was always given to, what is your final idea? You're always going to come up with the first idea, make sure that you'll try to make that succeed. So, with simple things like coaching the leaders to ask them, how many different things did you try before you came up with this solution? And that sets the expectation that, there is no one idea. There are multiple ideas that you're going to have to try. You're going to look at multiple things before you narrow down to the one that works for the customer best. So there were small things that the leader had to do in the way that he or she engaged with their teams to get them to think differently, or to get them to try different things before finalizing on one, and helping the team see their biases. So when we worked with this global security firm, we worked across, coaching the leadership as well as these catalyst teams working on the projects. And, it was over that period of time, it became so evident for all of them that the way that they were looking at their products, while it worked well today, it was important for them to change the way that they were working to truly create that benefit for the customer. And then it sort of scaled from there to look at other teams as well.
Right. Yeah. So, like you were, mentioning about this engineer who sort of, said that I'm not going to go back to that way of working ever again. What kind of mindset changes have you seen among people, which they sort of apply in other areas of life or work, professionally? The way they think, how has that changed? What have you seen?
Yeah. Something as simple as research and the power of asking open-ended questions and just being open to listening has been pretty big for a lot of people. So we've heard people talk about how they've not just applied it to work, but they've also applied it to their personal lives. At the end of the day, when they go back home and they're chatting with their family, they're asking questions and being genuinely interested in understanding them. Just something as simple as all of us go back home and we speak to somebody in the family and be like, how was your day? But we most often than not, most of us are being very inauthentic because it's something you ask. So whether it was in terms of connecting with the customer, asking those open-ended questions, that was something that people really took to and had that change in mindset. The other one, like I mentioned, was that whole think independently together. People, right from school, everyone's used to, like you said, brainstorming, being a particular way. Everybody check boxes that and says, yes, we brainstormed for this project at school or this project at work. But trying this new approach of giving everyone some time to think about it independently and then collaborating has been very, very, impactful for them. And it's actually one of the things, Harish, that we say that, you start with small things. You don't try and, if you're trying to bring design thinking into your team or into your organization, you can't, unless you're like truly transforming the organization ground up, you start by introducing small things. Even if you don't have everybody else in your corner trying to be part of that transformation, you can showcase value. So you go out and have a customer conversation, bring that customer conversation into a conversation, see the impact of it. The next time you're sitting with a bunch of colleagues to think about something, try think independently together. Once people see small evidence of change, see the benefit of doing something, then you can bring something else in. But everybody else who's not been exposed to that way of thinking will not right away jump to that way of thinking as well.
Right. Yeah. I think sometimes even just having that shared knowledge and terminology, language itself makes such a big difference in the way you think, because now you know that, yeah, when I say immersion, what does that really mean? Or when I say brainstorming, what does that really mean? I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why in one of our steps in the 6-step process is that whole leadership alignment, where you create a shared vision, you create a shared language that you can then translate down to the rest of the org, because it's very, very important. Otherwise, much like you and I discussed, somebody else's idea of brainstorming versus our idea of brainstorming is so different. That's why one of the things we do is, and people get really shocked, we're like, we don't actually encourage brainstorming. And people are like, isn't that what design thinking is about? And we're like, wait a second, we're talking about the traditional way of brainstorming, but there's a different way of doing it, which is a lot more impactful.
Right. Yeah. So what's like the sweet spot for companies to, come and start working with you? What do you look for in a company or a problem context when somebody comes to you?
Oh, I actually don't have a very concrete answer for you for that, because it varies so much for us. We love clients that are, ready to roll up their sleeves, get their hands dirty, and work with us on a problem. Because we encourage co-creation. They bring to the table their deep expertise in the industry that no matter how much we do research and secondary research, we're never going to account for their level of expertise. But given that, we also understand that there are organizations that are hard pressed for time, have so much else that's going on. And we work with clients where a few of them can work with us, but we do most of the heavy lifting as well in terms of the customer interactions. So there we then encourage the co-creation. We bring the research and understanding to work with them to co-create. So that's why there's no real sweet spot in that sense. I think the sweet spot or the mindset would be being open to really to not knowing what you're going to hear from the customer, being open to whatever you hear from the customer as well, and being open to to being iterative, to being doing those experiments and to learning from the customer. I think as long as they are open to trying something out and willing to listen to what the customer says, everything else will go along. And just to give you an example, there's a project that we work with this large e-commerce firm, and we were trying to understand some problems in terms of the seller platform. So because it's a marketplace, there are sellers who put products up, and the sellers were not understanding the payment section of the product. When we did that research, section of the team had this whole mindset of, we know our customers, we've been doing this for really long. What can you tell us about our customers that we don't already know? And when we encourage them to be part of the conversation, we got a few customers to their office. So we've done some of the research on our own, but when we were doing the co-creation with them, we actually got some of the customers to the office. And when they heard it from the customer's mouth, how some of the, how they perceive the organization or some of the challenges that they were having. There's nothing that can wake you up like that. So just being, even if they're not open, we'll find a way, but being open to a process is definitely important.
Right.
Even if they're not open to thinking that there's possibly a different way that the customer thinks.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And just extending this to organizational culture, right? About how, say, if for a fast-growing company, CEOs, founders sort of have this vision that I want to have a company which practices these values. They have the end state in mind. So how do you use elements of design thinking to sort of shape the culture to conform to the kind of values that these people start with, because that's the vision that they want to take the company towards from an organization culture standpoint.
Yeah. I think it's a combination of some of the things I mentioned earlier as well. It's the kind of questions the leaders ask. It's kind of encouraging. It's things where you encourage a multidisciplinary team to work together. So are the product managers or other designers working in silos, or is when they're discussing or ideating on something, is the engineer, the product manager, the data person, the marketing team member, the designer, are they all working together, quickly thinking, ideating on things together? What are some of the metrics that you're using? Is it just business focused metrics? Are you looking at what customer success metrics are? What are some of the things that you've heard from customers? Having a sense of, there are organizations where I've seen where they put up huge quotes from customers, and their walls have like these real customers and what they said around. So you're constantly around you can't possibly step out of office every day, but at least you're around that customer conversation. And things like not doing traditional brainstorming, but encouraging everybody to work together, not being judgmental about ideas, but looking at how you can build an idea, encourage other people's ideas, looking at multiple different ways to do that. Building prototypes, getting customer feedback at every stage of when you're building that product or even scaling that product. So the multiple little things that organizations can do. I understand the pace at which they want to move. The more they apply some of these little things, as much as it may seem like it's going to lengthen the process, it's only going to actually hasten the process.
So, we read your Medium post about the role of empathy and teaching. So, wanted to ask, what would you recommend to founders in terms of the role of empathy and teaching in an organization for them to better deal with their customers as well as their employees? What is the role of empathy? We've spoken a bit about empathy, but what is the role of teaching?
I think for any organization that's growing, you're constantly learning, right? You're learning from your customers, you're learning about new technologies, you're learning about new competitors. You're constantly learning. And I mean, I'm not going to generalize it, but a lot of the founders I know as individuals have that learning mindset. They're constantly reading all of these different books, speaking with mentors, trying to adopt these new ways. And it's important that the organization also has that culture. And I think we all learn from each other. Each person brings different kinds of experiences. Just to give you an example of how we do it at Pensaar is we create like a day where we learn from each other. Somebody or the other comes from a slightly varied background where they're able to bring that experience in. In a large organization, there are people coming from different functions, and it's important to learn how something works. I don't have to become a data analyst. If I know how that works, I can possibly do my work better as a product manager or as a designer. So learning is possibly the only constant in any organization. And to be able to teach, you need to be able to build empathy of who the learner is and what the learner is. I can't expect to go and teach. I'm using a really bad example of data analyzing for designers, but I can't expect to teach data analyzing to designers, expecting them to all come with an engineering background. So I really need to understand, how they think in the way that they consume information. If they're more visual, I can't just speak at them, but I may need to possibly create these little models that'll help them understand something. So being empathetic is really important. And it's not just important upfront when you're trying to prepare for how you're going to teach someone, but it's also important when you're teaching them. And we're constantly, I think, put in a situation, especially at Pensar, because when we're teaching design thinking to people, we know it like the back of our hand. We live and breathe design thinking. We constantly face this, where you have to build empathy. It may seem like a simple concept, but somebody else is not understanding it, and you have to understand their perspective. Why are they possibly not seeing it that way? Can I give them an example that will illustrate it better, which is closer to what they need? So going back to how a lot of people say, can you give me an example of my industry, my function? Maybe we can't give them an exact example of that, but if we're able to understand where they have a challenge, with the kind of problem that we're, the kind of case study that we're showing them, why they're not able to connect it. It could be that, for example, I'm showing them a marketing case study or an example of how design thinking is used, but they want to see what happens if it's a B2B company, how would that be? So it's about building a little bit of that empathy to understand where what is becoming a hindrance or a barrier for them, and trying to find ways that we can teach them that. And for a leader who's learning so much and wants to be able to change an organization, his or her organization, or bring new ways of thinking, you're constantly, in a sense, teaching. When you're mentoring your teams, you're teaching. When you're coaching your teams, you're teaching. So building that empathy for that other person, so you're bringing some of your experiences for those for the learner is also going to definitely help them, and also understanding their perspective, because the way I learn it would be different, because my life experiences allow me to see it differently than somebody else.
Right. Yeah. The
That
curse
makes
of
sense.
knowledge. The curse of knowledge
Yeah.
is what we all want to avoid, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So, any rituals that you've seen working well in your company or elsewhere, which sort of help in building a learning culture, like these learning sessions that you talked about? Anything else that you've seen working well?
So one is, of course, and these learning sessions don't have to be just internal. Getting external
Hmm.
points of view and perspectives is really important as well. I've also seen, uh, you know, um, people trying something on with that safe space to fail, where teams have been allowed to bring some new process or methodology and try that on for size, uh, and have, of course, have the ability to reach out to experts, but that safe space to try it out and learn. Um, there have been book exchanges, but then that's very like individual. And I think what's wonderful is I've also seen some organizations do the whole learn by doing. I guess there's nothing like learn by doing, where you're working together, learning something together. It could be even yoga or some in an organization, but everybody's trying to do something together and learn together, and learning a different way of thinking, building their knowledge.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So we've come to almost the end of the conversation now. Alisha, so one question that I wanted to pose to you was, what are the books, podcasts, courses, people that you follow, who have shaped and influenced your thinking, and things that you would recommend to our listeners as well?
Yeah. I think for me, creative confidence. for and it's quite wonderful because it sort of opens that way of thinking to not just designers. You know, for this is for the longest time, people have looked at design as being aesthetic. The good thing about design thinking is that it allowed people to see that it's not about aesthetics. It's about how you address the problem, how you try and understand it from the customer's point of view. So creative confidence was really wonderful in that way. There's also Infinite Games by Simon Sinek, which again sort of changes that perspective of how you look at success and how you measure success as an organization. That you're here for the long game. It's not about this competitor versus us. I listen to a lot of different TED talks. So there's around that's all very interesting because it goes back to the work that I do as well. You have to be vulnerable and you to be empathetic as well. And one of my favorite podcasts. I am a true crime podcast lover, but that has no context relevance to this. One of my favorite podcasts is Invisibilia because it really looks at human change and human mindset and sort of really, what is the word for it? It sort of really digs very deep into certain ways of thinking, certain ways of how people behave, and it really just sort of opens my brain every time I listen to it. Each time they take a different topic and they do that. So I'm always, me as a person, I'm constantly looking at getting exposed to really different things. I'm not somebody who only reads like these non-fiction business kind of books, but I'm always like looking at different kinds of articles or videos or podcasts that sort of really expand my way of thinking and looking at different kinds of connections. So Invisibilia definitely does that. That's one of the reasons I also like Simon Sinek in the way that he constantly changes the way that one thinks and looks at different problems. The golden circle as well is such an interesting concept. So yeah, I think, then for me, HBR, Forbes, Fast Company, they're my go-to for any other interesting articles.
Right. And any people to follow on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter?
Would be the same people that are behind all of these the content that's created. Simon Sinek, Brené Brown. If I can think of a few, I'll share them with you. But these were some that came to mind.
Sure. Yeah. In fact, an interesting thing was I actually found out about the show Ted Lasso on Brené Brown's podcast. And she's like a big fan of Ted Lasso, and that's how I started watching that show on Apple TV, and I became a big fan of it because it's like this American who goes to England to coach a football team there, and is only being used to the American football. So it's a very nice, interesting one, which I credit Brené Brown for introducing to me.
And sometimes it's the simplest things that people tell you, and I think for me those are the biggest eye openers, right? Things that are right in front of you. That seems so obvious, but when somebody breaks that down and tells you, like, gosh, that is so insightful, but you feel like you should have already known that. That's just how it is. Because even in terms of cultural transformation, like when you look at a good culture, it's about not working in silos, but sort of collaborating. It's about not looking for perfection, but constantly iterating and working fast towards what you need. It's letting failure not be a barrier, but being open to failure. When you look at all of that from a cultural perspective, it sounds so obvious and so normal, but because we all get stuck in that rut, or our focus becomes something operational or a deadline, we tend to forget these tenets of the culture, which, if not worked on, or if not transformed, then can sort of come hinder the success or the progress of an organization.
Right.
And that's why some of these authors and speakers just blow my mind, because Brené Brown just spoke about vulnerability,
Yeah.
which again is a very basic concept. But when she broke that down for most people, it was I think very insightful for a lot of people. The reason why she even became famous.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So we've come to the end of this conversation, but we won't let you go without asking for your hot takes on certain terms, topics, things. Basically, we'll be asking you about what do you think is the future relevance of whatever I'm going to tell you. So it's going to be a hot take of yours, right? So what do you think is the future relevance of non-fiction books?
I think people are constantly going to need new ways of thinking, and I actually see the whole section of nonfiction books really growing, and it's moving out of the whole earlier concept of seeing them as self-help books, but just different ways of thinking, different um, philosophies or different frameworks to look at something. When Sprint came out, even though as design thinkers we're very familiar with it, but it blew people's mind because like, oh, we can get things done in 5 days. We can follow that entire process. So I think it just allows people to think about things differently, and it's only going to grow. I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
Okay. What do you think is the future relevance of NFTs?
To be really honest, I still have to wrap my head around it. I know I can't fathom why a random little cartoon gets billions and millions of dollars, but I guess it's here to stay. I guess in a way, uh, we're allowing not just a few to have that ability to create art or control art, but or anything like art, because NFT started with a little bit of art as well. But it sort of allows, I don't know if it democratizes it, but it allows people to partake in it. So I still have to understand it. It's beyond me, but I guess it's here to stay.
Okay. And the final one, what do you think is the future relevance of sarees?
Oh, I really hope it's here and it's going to stand the test of time, because I have a soft corner for sarees. My mom and I tried to revive the whole Kerala saree, look at it differently. So it's a beautiful garment, and it's something that I think as Indians, not to be just patriotic, but it's to the fact that it's just a piece of cloth, but it's an amazing garment, and it allows us to celebrate the rich craft and culture that we have, the craft history that we have in the country, and I don't think we should lose that. There are so many different kinds of sarees, so I hope it's here to stay. I really hope so, but even I wear it, so I don't wear it as frequently as I'd like to. So I hope it stays.
Yeah. So I think there's more wishful thinking there, as well as what you think is really going to happen. So on that note, Alisha, I think we covered a whole range of topics today, from how design thinking has evolved over the years in India as a practice, as a function. How can companies use design thinking? What are principles of design thinking that individuals can sort of implement, practice in their lives, changes in mindset? So I think we've covered a whole range of topics, and this is a great conversation. I'm sure all our listeners will really enjoy this. And
I hope so. I really hope so. There's just so much that can be spoken design thinking, and I'm sure I didn't do it enough justice. But it goes beyond that term. Sometimes that term itself is counterintuitive, because people think, oh, it's got design up front, so it must be only something that designers can do. But there's a lot of value in that way of thinking.
Yeah, and we've got your dog's voice also on this podcast. Finally, you were worried that sort of steal your thunder at the start of the conversation. Didn't?
Yeah, he definitely wanted to be heard and be part of it.
Yes. On that note, thanks a lot, Alisha.
Thank you so much, Harish.
If you like this, we know you care about your and your team's future relevance. You can find us and click on the subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, Google and Apple Podcasts. You can also find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. There are 2 ways to enter the insider group of friends of CTQ. A Telegram channel where you'll get daily tidbits that help you think about future relevance, and our weekly email newsletter called The Upleveler. We've got some fabulous testimonials from our subscribers. We share special discount codes for CTQ compounds and exclusive invitations to our events on both these channels. Just go to choosetothink.com, that is think with a Q, and you'll find all the links to subscribe. You owe it to yourself.